Imagine for a second that you bite into a wedge of a really sharp lemon.
Oh, just thinking about it makes my jaw ache.
Right. In a fraction of a second, your mouth waters. I mean, the acidity hits your tongue, and your salivary glands just flood your mouth to buffer it. It feels completely instantaneous.
But the underlying wiring to make that happen is astonishing.
Exactly. Because to make that happen, a microscopic chemical signal had to travel from your tongue, jump onto this hijacked branch of your facial nerve, literally squeeze through a tiny fissure in the temporal bone of your skull, and then, and this is the crazy part, physically cross right over the vibrating membrane of your eardrum.
It really is wild when you trace it out.
It dives into a hidden ganglion and finally triggers a salivary gland. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are mapping the invisible architecture that makes you experience the world.
Yeah, if our previous deep dive on Chapter 17 was all about the central processor, the brain and spinal cord, this exploration of Chapter 18 is fundamentally about the distribution network.
The cables running out of the server room.
Spot on. We're tracing the 12 cranial nerves. These are 12 distinct pathways leaving the brainstem. And our core philosophy for this analysis remains anchored in one universal truth, which is that we are studying structure in service of function.
So the physical layout matters.
It dictates everything. How these nerves are physically routed dictates their vulnerability to disease, how a surgeon must navigate them in the operating theater, and ultimately the clinical outcome for the patient.
We're taking the textbook of Head and Neck Anatomy by Hyatt and Gartner as our structural spine today, and I want to set the stage for you, the listener, right now. Take your finger and just trace the line from your earlobe down to your jawline.
A very familiar anatomical landmark.
Yeah, right beneath the skin and fascia, right there, a nerve is fanning out like the fingers of a hand, constantly firing just to give you your facial expression. So we aren't just memorizing cables today, we are looking at the evolutionary arms race of the human head.
I love that phrasing because the evolutionary context is vital here. To really grasp the cranial nerves, we must first distinguish them from the spinal nerves.
Because they play by different rules, right?
Completely different rules.
Yeah.
I mean, spinal nerves are relatively straightforward. They emerge between the vertebrae and supply the general body wall and the limbs. It's a very segmental, predictable pattern.
Motor out the front, sensory in the back.
Exactly. But the cranial nerves, however, they have to wire a highly specialized, rapidly evolving structure, the head and neck. They supply special senses, and critically, they supply musculature derived from the embryonic pharyngeal arches.
Ah, the branchiomeric muscles.
Yes, so because the target structures are far more complex, the nerves themselves have to speak different languages.
Right, and the source material outlines these specific functional components or modalities, but I really want to avoid just reading a dry glossary of acronyms. Broadly speaking, we are dividing these cables into general and special functions, and somatic versus visceral targets, correct?
That is the fundamental dichotomy, yeah. General modalities are the standard signals we see throughout the entire body. Touch, pain, temperature, voluntary muscle movement.
The stuff a spinal nerve could do blindfolded.
Spot on. But special modalities, those are entirely unique to the head. Sight, hearing, balance, and the movement of those specific pharyngeal arch muscles, like your muscles of facial expression and mastication.
Okay, let me push back on one of these classifications because it seems entirely counterintuitive on paper. The modality for smell and taste is termed SVA. So that's special visceral afferent. Now, I understand afferent means sensory input traveling back up to the brain.
Right.
But why use the word visceral for something happening on the tip of my tongue or like inside my nose? I think of viscera as my intestines.
It seems odd, I grant you, until you consider the underlying biological mechanism. For an SVA receptor to fire, the environmental stimulus actually must be dissolved in a fluid.
Oh, I see.
Yet, odorants must dissolve in the nasal mucus, and tastants have to dissolve in your saliva. It is fundamentally a chemical sense. And evolutionarily speaking, these chemical senses are deeply tied to our gut-level survival responses.
Like smelling gone-off milk.
Exactly. Smelling putrid meat or sour milk triggers a visceral autonomic gag reflex to protect the gastrointestinal tract. It is a chemical integration that completely bypasses conscious thought and speaks directly to our visceral systems.
That makes total sense. It's basically a chemical gatekeeper for the digestive and respiratory tracts. So those are the types of signals we are dealing with today. Let's look at the anatomical pathways themselves, and rather than going purely in numerical order from 1 to 12, which can be a bit tedious,
Very tedious.
let's group them by their functional narrative. So we'll start with the pure sensory specialists. Cranial nerves, the 1st, 2, and 8. These are the nerves that solely listen to the world.
A great place to start. The olfactory nerve, cranial nerve, IX, carries that SVA modality for smell that we just talked about, and its structural layout is remarkably direct.
It doesn't have far to go, right?
No, not at all. The receptor cell bodies sit high up in the nasal cavity, in the olfactory mucosa, right over the superior nasal concha. And their axons project upwards, piercing directly through the floor of the cranium.
Through the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. If you look at that bone in a skull model, it literally looks like a sieve. It's just perforated with dozens of tiny little holes.
And those perforations allow the fragile olfactory nerve fibers to pass directly into the cranial vault and synapse in the olfactory bulb, which just rests immediately on top of the bone.
It's sitting right there.
Yeah. And from there, the olfactory tract sweeps straight back into the cerebrum. It is uniquely the only sensory system that completely bypasses the thalamic relay station and goes directly to the cortex.
Which perfectly explains why a specific smell can instantly trigger a super vivid, deeply buried memory before you even consciously register what the smell actually is.
Exactly.
The wiring is just a direct line to the limbic system. Okay, let's move to cranial nerve 2s, the optic nerve, carrying special somatic afferent, or SSA, signals for vision. The visual pathway starts in the retina, but the structural identity of this nerve is completely different from the others, isn't it?
It really is an anomaly. I mean, the optic nerve is not a true peripheral nerve at all. Embryologically, it is an outgrowth of the diencephalon of the brain.
So it's basically brain tissue on a stalk.
Essentially, yes. The receptor cells, the rods and cones, pass signals to the retinal ganglion cells. And it's the axons of these ganglion cells that bundle together to form the optic nerve, which travels posteriorly through the orbit, exiting the bony socket via the optic foramen.
And because it's technically brain tissue, its physical insulation is entirely different. And this is a really crucial clinical point. Most peripheral nerves are wrapped in myelin produced by Schwann cells, but the optic nerve
is myelinated by oligodendrocytes. Those are the specific glial cells of the central nervous system. And we see the clinical manifestation of this embryological quirk in demyelinating diseases like multiple sclerosis.
Yeah, because MS is an autoimmune attack specifically targeting central nervous system myelin. The immune system completely ignores Schwann cells.
Exactly.
So a patient might present to a clinic with a sudden, really painful loss of vision in one eye, optic neuritis, and that isolated symptom is actually the very first diagnostic indicator of a systemic central nervous system disease.
The structural vulnerability directly dictates the clinical presentation. And following the optic nerve backwards, it enters the cranial cavity and meets its counterpart at the optic chiasma, where the nasal retinal fibers decussate.
They cross over.
Yeah, they cross over, which allows for binocular vision and depth perception. From there, the optic tracts wrap around the cerebral peduncles to synapse in the lateral geniculate nucleus.
Okay, we will definitely come back to the eye shortly because physically moving it requires a massive amount of hardware. But just to finish the pure sensory trio, we have cranial nerve 8th, the vestibulocochlear nerve, SSA for hearing and balance.
Right, and this is essentially two distinct physiological systems just bundled into a single anatomical cable for convenience.
Like a cone core wire.
Exactly. Both originate in the petrous portion of the temporal bone, which, fun fact, is the densest bone in the human body.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the cochlear nerve originates from the organ of Corti in the spiral cochlea, which is responsible for audition or hearing. Its cell bodies sit in the spiral ganglion.
And then the vestibular nerve handles equilibrium, originating from the semicircular canals and the utricle and saccule.
Spot on. Their cell bodies sit in the vestibular ganglion. These two functional divisions merge together and exit the inner ear through the internal acoustic meatus, traveling a very short distance through the subarachnoid space to enter the brainstem at the pontomedullary junction.
Okay, so nerves 3 and 8 bring the environment into the brain. They are the receivers. But perceiving the environment often requires interacting with it. I mean, if you hear a loud noise via nerve 8, you instantly need to turn your eyes to look at it.
And that requires motors.
Exactly. That brings us to the ocular motor group, nerves the 3rd, 4, and 6. And mapping the system is a bit like reverse engineering, an incredibly complex gimbal for a camera.
That's a perfect analogy. The human eye has 6 extraocular muscles dedicated to its movement, plus a muscle to elevate the upper eyelid. Coordinating all of this requires immense neurological real estate. Let's examine cranial nerve third first, the oculomotor nerve.
The heavy lifter.
Oh, absolutely. It is the primary workhorse, carrying general somatic efferent, or GSE, fibers to 5 of those 7 muscles.
So let me list those out. So it innervates the levator palpebrae superioris to lift the lid, and the superior, medial, and inferior recti, plus the inferior oblique. That gives the eye the ability to look up, down, and medially. But it also carries a sort of hidden autonomic payload.
It does a critical general visceral efferent, or GVE, parasympathetic component. Deep in the midbrain, the Edinger-Westphal nucleus generates preganglionic parasympathetic fibers that travel within the oculomotor nerve.
Let me just trace this spatially for everyone listening. So the nerve leaves the brainstem. It pushes forward through the cavernous sinus, which is this massive venous pool at the base of the skull we definitely need to touch on later, and it enters the back of the eye socket through the superior orbital fissure. Once it's inside the orbit, what do those parasympathetic fibers actually do?
Well, they peel off and synapse at a tiny relay station called the ciliary ganglion, which is situated just behind the eyeball. The new postganglionic fibers then pierce the sclera via the short ciliary nerves to reach 2 internal smooth muscles.
Okay, which ones?
The sphincter pupillae, which constricts the pupil in response to bright light, and the ciliar muscle, which physically changes the curvature of the lens.
Ah, accommodation. Focusing the camera lens for near vision. So nerve the third handles gross movement, aperture, and focus, which honestly begs the question. If the oculomotor nerve is doing almost all the heavy lifting, why do we have cranial nerve third, the trochlear nerve, dedicated entirely to one single muscle? That seems terribly inefficient from a structural standpoint.
I agree, it looks odd, but it speaks to the evolutionary necessity of highly refined binocular tracking. The trochlear nerve provides GSE innervation solely to the superior oblique muscle.
And that muscle is weird, right?
It is functionally fascinating. It runs forward along the medial wall of the orbit, passes through a fibrous connective tissue ring called the trochlea, which acts as a literal pulley, and then it turns sharply backwards and outwards to attach to the top of the eyeball.
So when that muscle contracts, it pulls the back of the eye up and in, which mechanically rotates the front of the eye down and out. It's a really complex multi-axis rotation.
Precisely. And controlling that specific nuanced torque requires dedicated wiring. The trochlear nerve itself is an anatomical oddity too. I mean, it is the smallest cranial nerve by axon count, yet it has the longest intracranial course.
Oh, because it exits out the back.
Yes, it is the only cranial nerve to emerge from the dorsal surface of the brainstem. It has to wrap all the way around the midbrain before heading forward to the cavernous sinus.
So it takes the scenic route. And rounding out the joystick trio is cranial nerve the sixth, the abducens nerve. And, well, as the name suggests, it abducts the eye.
It provides GSE innervation to the lateral rectus muscle, pulling the gaze laterally away from the midline. It has a long vertical ascent up the clivus of the skull base, makes a really sharp 90-degree turn over the petrous apex, and travels directly through the center of the cavernous sinus alongside the internal carotid artery.
And that spatial routing is a setup for absolute disaster, isn't it? I mean, if a patient develops an infection that spreads to the cavernous sinus thrombosis or an aneurysm of the internal carotid artery, the abducens nerve is sitting right in the line of fire.
It is uniquely vulnerable in that space. And if it fails, the mechanical balance of the eye is completely destroyed. In an abducens nerve palsy, the lateral rectus is paralyzed.
So it can't pull out.
Right. And the medial rectus, which is innervated by the healthy oculomotor nerve, now has absolutely no opposing force. So it pulls the eye forcefully inward, resulting in a medial deviation and severe diplopia, or double vision.
We see that exact same principle of unopposed muscle action if the oculomotor nerve is injured, don't we? The medial, superior, and inferior recti are all offline. So the intact lateral rectus pulls the eye out, the intact superior oblique pulls it down, and the patient presents with an eye that is permanently gazing down and out.
Plus, they'll have profound ptosis because the levator palpebrae cannot lift the eyelid, and a blown, dilated pupil that is entirely unresponsive to light because the parasympathetic constrictor fibers are gone.
It's a perfect diagnostic picture.
The clinical picture perfectly maps to the structural deficit. You can't ask for better anatomy.
Okay, so we've wired the senses, we've wired the eyes. Now we reach the most complex structural puzzle in the head, which is the face and the jaws. We are dealing with cranial nerve V, the trigeminal nerve, and cranial nerve the seventh, the facial nerve. And the source material reveals this incredible, almost competitive collaboration between these two nerves. So let's start with the great integrator, the trigeminal.
The trigeminal nerve is the massive sensory highway of the head, and it's also the motor supply to the first pharyngeal arch. It emerges from the lateral pons as a large sensory root and a much smaller motor root.
And they travel forward into a pocket of duramater called Meckel's cave, right? Which sits on the floor of the middle cranial fossa.
Yes, Meckel's cave houses the trigeminal ganglion, also known as the semilunar ganglion. Think of this as the main sensory circuit breaker panels for your entire face. The cell bodies for general sensation GSA, for touch, pain, temperature, all live here. And from this massive ganglion, the nerve splits into three massive trunks, V1, V2, and V3. Let's route the cables.
Let's do it. So V1, the ophthalmic division, is purely sensory. It passes forward through the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus and enters the orbit through the superior orbital fissure. Its primary mandate is the upper face.
And it branches almost immediately. The frontal nerve runs along the roof of the orbit, splitting into the supraorbital and supratrochlear nerves to supply the skin of the forehead and the scalp all the way back to the crown of your head.
It also gives off the lacrimal nerve to provide sensation to the skin of the upper eyelid and the lacrimal gland, and crucially, the nasociliary branch. This provides sensory innervation to the cornea of the eye itself, the mucous membranes of the ethmoid and sphenoid sinuses, and ultimately emerges right onto the face to supply the skin on the bridge and tip of the nose.
So if you scratch your cornea or feel a really deep tension headache above your eyebrows, that is V1 firing back into the trigeminal ganglion.
That's V1. What about V2, the maxillary division? Because it has to navigate a much more enclosed space.
V2 is also purely sensory. It exits the middle cranial fossa through the foramen rotundum. This bony tunnel just dumps the nerve into a tiny, incredibly crowded space called the pterygopalatine fossa.
I think of it as the grand central station of the midface.
An incredibly apt description. From this fossa, V2 sends branches in every direction to supply the midface. The zygomatic branch heads laterally to feel the cheek and temple. The descending palatine branches drop vertically to supply the hard and soft palate, so the roof of the mouth.
And what about the teeth?
The superior alveolar nerves branch off to form a dental plexus, innervating all the maxillary teeth and the lining of the maxillary sinus. And then the main trunk of V2 pushes forward through the floor of the orbit and emerges directly out of the face via the infraorbital foramen, supplying the lower eyelid, the side of the nose, and the upper lip.
Okay, so upper face is V1, mid face is V2. That leaves V3, the mandibular division. And here the structural rules completely change because V3 is a mixed nerve.
Yes, V3 carries both GSA sensory fibers and special visceral efferent, or XVE, motor fibers. And instead of going forward, V3 drops straight down through the floor of the skull via the foramen oval, entering the infratemporal fossa.
Let's trace the motor fibers first. SVE innervation to the muscles of the first pharyngeal arch. These are the heavy lifters.
The muscles of mastication. V3 provides motor commands to the really powerful masseter and temporalis muscles which crush and grind your food, and the medial and lateral pterygoids which move the jaw side to side.
But it also innervates a few smaller, deeply hidden muscles that are embryologically related, right? The anterior belly of the digastric, the mylohyoid in the floor of the mouth, the tensor veli-palatini, which tenses the soft palate, and the tensor tympani.
Ah, that last one is a brilliant piece of anatomical trivia with massive clinical implications. The tensor tympani is a tiny muscle located in the middle ear. Its sole job is to pull the malleus bone, which dampens the vibration of the eardrum in response to loud noises, particularly the sound of your own chewing.
I want to pause here and deduce something. If a patient suffers a severe motor lesion of V3, say, a tumor compressing the nerve as it exits the foramen oval, the muscles of mastication on that side are completely paralyzed. So if you ask that patient to open their mouth, the jaw will deviate. Which way?
It will deviate towards the side of the lesion.
Because of unopposed muscle action again.
Exactly.
The healthy lateral pterygoid on the opposite side contracts, pushing the jaw forward and across the midline. And the paralyzed side cannot push back, so the jaw just swings towards the dead nerve.
That is the mechanical reality of it. And because the tensor tympani is also paralyzed, that patient will invariably complain of hyperacusis. Normal sounds, especially their own voice and their own chewing, will seem unbearably painfully loud.
Wow, it's all connected. Let's finish V3 with its sensory territory.
Well, it is extensive. The buccal nerve supplies the cheek. The auriculotemporal nerve loops backward, wrapping right around the middle meningeal artery to supply the temporomandibular joint, the external acoustic meatus, and the skin of the temple.
And then two massive trunks dive downward. The inferior alveolar nerve enters the mandible itself, providing sensory supply to all the lower teeth before emerging at the chin as the mental nerve to feel the lower lip.
And finally, the lingual nerve. This travels deep into the floor of the mouth to provide GSA, general touch, pain, and temperature sensation to the anterior two-thirds of the tongue.
Okay, here is where we hit the most fascinating structural concept in head and neck anatomy. You've just mapped the trigeminal nerve, and it is this vast, deeply entrenched highway system reaching every surface of the face, eye, nose, and mouth. But the source material details multiple parasympathetic ganglia, the ciliary, pterygopalatine, submandibular, and otic ganglia. These ganglia are physically suspended from branches of the trigeminal nerve. Yet, the parasympathetic commands they receive originate from completely different cranial nerves. Why is the trigeminal nerve acting as a structural taxi service?
Think about the evolutionary problem of building a face. Cranial nerves, the third, 7, and IX, possess the parasympathetic preganglionic fibers, the spark, if you will, necessary to stimulate glands to produce tears and saliva.
Okay.
But these nerves primarily serve other complex functions. If they had to build their own dedicated parallel pathways through all the dense bone and fascia to reach every individual gland, it would be a colossal waste of biological energy and space.
It's completely redundant infrastructure. Why lay new asphalt when the trigeminal nerve already has a superhighway leading exactly to the target?
Exactly the mechanism we see. The parasympathetic fibers just hitchhike. Take the lacrimal gland, which produces tears. The facial nerve, cranial nerve, the seventh, wants to trigger tearing. So it sends a preganglionic fiber via the greater petrosal nerve to the pterygopalatine ganglion.
Which is physically hanging off V2 in the pterygopalatine fossa.
Right. The facial nerve fiber synapse is there. The new postganglionic fiber then hops onto V2's zygomatic branch, rides it up the lateral wall of the orbit, jumps across a little communicating branch to V1's lacrimal nerve, and finally arrives at the lacrimal gland. The facial nerve provides the command, but the trigeminal provides the transit system.
And we see the exact same thing with the parotid gland. The glossopharyngeal nerve, IX, sends the signal to the otic ganglion, which is hanging off V3, just below the foramen oval. The postganglionic fibers then jump onto V3's auriculotemporal nerve to hitch a ride up to the parotid gland. It's an exquisitely elegant solution to a spatial problem.
It really is. And this integration perfectly segues into cranial nerve itself, the facial nerve, because the facial nerve isn't just a passenger. It is a sprawling, highly complex system of its own. It is the master of expression, serving the second pharyngeal arch. It carries 5 separate modalities: SVE for facial muscles, GVE for glandular secretion, SVA for taste, GVA for visceral sensation, and a tiny bit of GSA around the ear.
Let's map its somewhat tortuous path. It leaves the pontomedullary junction in 2 routes, a large motor route and a smaller sensory parasympathetic route called the nervus intermedius. Where do they go?
They plunge directly into the petrous temporal bone through the internal acoustic meatus, traveling right alongside the vestibulocochlear nerve. Deep inside the bone, the facial nerve enters its own private tunnel, the facial canal.
And within this really dense bony vault, it makes a sharp backwards turn. And right at that elbow is the geniculate ganglion, housing the sensory cell bodies.
While traversing this bony canal, the facial nerve gives off 3 critical branches before it even sees the outside of the skull. The first is the greater petrosal nerve, which we just discussed, carrying parasympathetic fibers to the pterygopalatine ganglion.
The second is the nerve to the stapedius, and this echoes the tensor tympani we talked about with V3, doesn't it?
It does, perfectly. The stapedius is a minute SVE muscle attached to the stapes bone in the middle ear. It contracts to dampen acicular vibration. If the facial nerve is injured in the canal, this muscle paralyzes and the patient experiences severe hyperacusis.
And the third branch inside the temporal bone is the architectural marvel we mentioned at the very beginning of the deep dive, the chorda tympani.
The routing of the chorda tympani borders on the absurd, quite frankly.
It's so weird.
It branches off the descending facial nerve, travels backwards, and physically enters the middle ear cavity. It then passes forward, draping itself directly across the medial surface of the tympanic membrane, the eardrum, and crosses the handle of the malleus bone.
It is literally a nerve stretched tightly across the vibrating surface of the eardrum.
From there, it escapes the skull through a tiny crack called the petrotympanic fissure, diving deep into the infratemporal fossa.
And what is its payload? I mean, what is so important that it takes this perilous journey?
2 very specific things. SVA fibers carrying the sensation of taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, and GVE parasympathetic fibers destined for the salivary glands. Once it exits the skull, it finds the lingual nerve, which is a branch of V3, remember, and physically joins it.
Hitchhiking again.
Always. The taste fibers ride the lingual nerve backwards from the tongue to the brain. The parasympathetic fibers ride the lingual nerve forwards, peeling off to synapse at the submandibular ganglion. From there, postganglionic fibers drive the submandibular and sublingual glands to produce saliva.
So just to recap that loop for you, you taste a lemon. The chemical SVA signal travels up the lingual nerve, which is V3. It transfers to the chorda tympani, crosses your eardrum, enters the facial nerve, it's the 7, and goes to the brainstem.
That's the sensory side.
Right. And then the brainstem fires a GVE response back down the facial nerve, across the eardrum via the chorda tympani, back onto the lingual nerve, into the submandibular ganglion, and finally to the salivary glands. That is a staggering amount of cross-communication.
It is. Now, the main trunk of the facial nerve, carrying all the SVE motor fibers, finally exits the base of the skull via the stylomastoid foramen.
It's out in the open.
It gives off a few small branches to the posterior belly of the digastric and the stylohyoid muscle, and then it plunges straight into the substance of the parotid salivary gland.
But it doesn't innervate the parotid gland. We established the glossopharyngeal nerve does that.
Correct. It merely uses the parotid gland as a physical matrix to divide and conquer. Inside the gland, it splits into the parotid plexus, yielding 5 major terminal branches: temporal, zygomatic, buccal, mandibular, and cervical.
If you place the heel of your hand right over your ear and fan your fingers across your face, your fingers trace those exact 5 branches.
And those branches provide motor innervation to the entire superficial musculature of the face. The orbicularis oculi to close the eye, the frontalis to raise the eyebrows, the zygomaticus major to smile, the orbicularis oris to purse your lips.
Which brings us directly to the clinical reality of Bell's palsy. This is an acute, unilateral, flaccid paralysis of the facial muscles, often due to viral inflammation of the facial nerve as it sits tightly packed inside that facial canal.
Because the swelling compresses the nerve against the rigid bone, the downstream fibers are starved of conduction. The clinical presentation is dramatic. The patient presents with a profound facial droop. The affected half of the face is completely expressionless.
They can't smile on that side, the nasolabial fold just flattens out, and saliva might drool from the corner of the mouth because the orbicularis oris lacks tone. But what about the eye?
That is the most dangerous consequence, actually. The orbicularis oculi is paralyzed, meaning the patient simply cannot close their eye. Because V1 is still intact, they feel the pain of the dry eye, but they have absolutely no motor ability to blink. The cornea can rapidly ulcerate, if not artificially protected.
And building on our structural map, depending on exactly where in the facial canal the nerve is compressed, the patient might present with more than just muscle weakness.
We see the cascading failure of those 3 internal branches. If the lesion is high enough before the chorda tympani branches off, they will complain of a metallic or totally absent sense of taste on the anterior tongue.
Oh, wow.
And if it's above the nerve to the stapedius, they will experience hyperacusis.
The functional deficit perfectly isolates the anatomical lesion. Okay, we are moving down the brainstem, leaving the face and entering the throat and the viscera. Nerves 9X, X, X, and 12. Let's start with cranial nerve 9X, the glossopharyngeal nerve.
Well, glosso meaning tongue, pharyngeal meaning throat. It is the nerve of the third pharyngeal arch. It exits the posterior cranial fossa through the jugular foramen. Like the facial nerve, it carries 5 modalities, but its motor SVE distribution is remarkably small. It innervates exactly 1 muscle.
Just the stylopharyngeus,
Yeah.
which elevates the pharynx during swallowing.
That is its only voluntary motor role. Its true power lies in its sensory and autonomic functions. We already discussed its GVE role, driving the parotid gland via the lesser petrosal nerve and the otic ganglion.
So what about the sensory side?
It is the primary sensory sentinel for the back of the mouth. It carries GSA and GVA fibers for general touch, pain, and temperature, as well as SVA fibers for taste, from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, the palatine tonsils, and the upper pharynx.
So when you swallow a really large pill and feel it scrape the back of your throat, that is the glossopharyngeal nerve firing.
Furthermore, it receives critical visceral input from the carotid bifurcation in the neck. It innervates the carotid sinus, which is a baroreceptor monitoring arterial blood pressure, and the carotid body, a chemoreceptor monitoring blood oxygen and carbon dioxide levels. It provides the continuous afferent data the brainstem needs to regulate cardiovascular output.
A vital survival cable, full stop. Now for the absolute giant of the system. Cranial nerve X, the vagus nerve, the wanderer.
The vagus nerve commands the 4th and 6th pharyngeal arches. It carries GVE, SVE, GVA, GSA, and SVA modalities. It exits the jugular foramen right alongside the glossopharyngeal nerve, possessing two sensory ganglia, the superior and inferior nodose ganglia.
And it earns the name Wanderer because it completely ignores the boundaries of the head and neck.
Oh, entirely. Unlike any other cranial nerve, it descends vertically through the neck, wrapped tightly within the carotid sheath alongside the internal jugular vein and common carotid artery. It passes right into the thorax, providing massive parasympathetic networks to the heart and lungs, and then it follows the esophagus through the diaphragm to innervate the abdominal viscera all the way to the splenic flexure of the colon.
It is the parasympathetic highway of the human body. But let's just restrict our focus back to the head and neck. What is the vagus doing locally?
It provides the vast majority of the motor control for swallowing and speaking. High in the neck, it gives off pharyngeal branches that merge into the pharyngeal plexus to drive the pharyngeal constrictor muscles and the muscles of the soft palate.
And then it tackles the larynx, the voice box. And this is where we see one of the most famous anatomical detours in all of biology, the recurrent laryngeal nerve.
The branching here is highly asymmetrical. The vagus descends into the lower neck. On the right side, the recurrent laryngeal nerve branches off, loops underneath the right subclavian artery, and ascends back up the neck in the groove between the trachea and the esophagus to enter the larynx.
So it goes down just to come back up. But the left side is even more extreme, isn't it?
Oh, much more. The left vagus nerve actually enters the superior mediastinum of the chest before giving off the left recurrent laryngeal nerve. This branch must loop entirely underneath the arch of the aorta, right above the beating heart, before making the long, arduous ascent back up the neck to the larynx.
From an engineering perspective, taking a nerve destined for the throat, routing it down into the chest cavity, wrapping it around the largest artery in the body, and threading it back up the neck is madness. Why does this happen?
Embryology dictates the anatomy. In the early embryo, the structures of the neck, including the developing pharyngeal arches and the primitive heart tube, are situated very close together. The nerve fibers simply grow a very short, direct distance to their target muscles.
But then the embryo elongates.
Right. The heart descends rapidly into the developing thoracic cavity, and as it drops, it drags the associated vasculature with it. The recurrent laryngeal nerves get caught beneath these descending aortic arch vessels. They are physically pulled down into the chest and are forced to stretch and elongate behind the descending heart, creating this massive recurring loop back to their original targets in the larynx.
It is literal evolutionary baggage. And what does the nerve do once it finally gets back up to the larynx?
The recurrent laryngeal nerve provides SVE motor innervation to all the intrinsic muscles of the larynx. The posterior cricoridinoid, the lateral cricoridinoid, the thyroradenoid. These are the muscles that abduct, adduct, and adjust the tension of the vocal folds.
Except for one muscle.
Ah, yes. The cricothyroid muscle. That muscle is innervated by a totally different branch of the vagus, the external branch of the superior laryngeal nerve, which takes a very direct downward path from the upper neck.
Now, this looping anatomy of the recurrent laryngeal nerve makes it incredibly vulnerable, particularly to surgical trauma, doesn't it?
Extremely vulnerable. Because it ascends right along the posterior border of the thyroid gland, any surgery on the thyroid or parathyroid glands carries a high risk of iatrogenic injury to this nerve.
So if a surgeon accidentally severs and crushes a recurrent laryngeal nerve during a thyroidectomy, what is the clinical presentation?
A unilateral injury paralyzes the intrinsic laryngeal muscles on one side. The vocal fold on that side cannot move to the midline to meet its partner during phonation. The patient will present with severe dysphonia, basically a hoarse, breathy voice.
And if both are injured?
Bilateral transection is a catastrophic airway emergency. The vocal folds lose all abduction tone and can be pulled completely closed by the negative pressure of inspiration, sealing the airway and requiring an immediate, life-saving tracheotomy.
The margins for error are incredibly slim. All right, moving on to cranial nerve as the accessory nerve. The source material highlights that this nerve has a bit of an identity crisis.
It does. It is a purely motor SVE nerve, but it exists in two distinct parts, a cranial root and a spinal root. The cranial root emerges from the medulla of the brainstem, but its independence is very short-lived.
It almost immediately joins the vagus nerve, right?
Yes. In fact, when we say the vagus nerve provides motor innervation to the muscles of the pharynx, soft palate, and larynx, the actual axon fibers doing the work originally belonged to the cranial root of the accessory nerve. They simply use the vagus as a delivery system.
So the vagus takes all the credit for swallowing, but the cranial accessory is actually doing the heavy lifting. What about the spinal root?
The spinal root is fascinating. It originates not in the brain, but from motor neurons in the anterior horn of the upper 5 or 6 cervical segments of the spinal cord.
Okay, so it starts in the neck.
Right. These fibers emerge from the side of the spinal cord, ascend upward, pass through the foramen magnum into the cranial cavity, briefly join the cranial root, and then immediately exit the skull again through the jugular foramen.
It climbs all the way up into the skull just to turn around and walk back out the exact same door as the vagus and glossopharyngeal nerves. Where does it go from there?
It descends obliquely through the neck to provide motor innervation to 2 massive muscles. First, it pierces and supplies the sternocleidomastoid muscle, which allows you to turn your head to the opposite side and flex your neck. It then crosses the posterior triangle of the neck to innervate the trapezius muscle, which elevates the scapula, allowing you to shrug your shoulders.
So clinical testing for the accessory nerve is straightforward. You just ask the patient to shrug their shoulders against resistance and ask them to turn their head against your hand.
Precisely. Asymmetry and strength totally isolates the lesion.
Which brings us to the final pathway. Cranial nerves to 12, the hypoglossal nerve.
The hypoglossal is a cured GSE motor nerve. It emerges from the medulla and exits the skull through its own dedicated bony tunnel, the hypoglossal canal, situated right near the foramen magnum.
Hypo meaning under, glossal meaning tongue. Its entire purpose is tongue movement.
It loops down into the upper neck, crossing superficial to the internal and external carotid arteries, and dives deep to the mylohyoid muscle to enter the substance of the tongue from below. It provides motor innervation to all the intrinsic muscles of the tongue, the longitudinal, transverse, and vertical fibers that change the tongue's shape.
Rolling the tongue, flattening it out.
Yes, exactly. And it innervates 3 of the 4 extrinsic muscles of the tongue: the genioglossus, which protrudes the tongue, the hyoglossus, which depresses it, and the styloglossus, which retracts it.
Now, you specified 3 of the 4. Which extrinsic muscle is excluded?
The palatoglossus muscle. Because it is developmentally associated with the soft palate, it is innervated by the vagus nerve via the pharyngeal plexus.
Let's test the mechanical logic again here. If a patient has a severe lesion of the hypoglossal nerve on the right side, perhaps from a traumatic jaw fracture or a tumor, the right half of the tongue is completely paralyzed. Over time, that muscle will atrophy and appear physically shrunken. If you ask that patient to stick their tongue straight out, what happens?
When protruded, the tongue will deviate towards the right side, towards the lesion.
We see the unopposed action again. The healthy genioglossus muscle on the left side contracts. Its job is to pull the base of the tongue forward, thrusting the tip out. But because the right side is dead weight and isn't pushing, the left side dominates and forces the tip of the tongue to sweep over to the right.
The anatomy dictates the physical sign. We say the tongue points to the pathology.
We have mapped 12 incredible pathways today. But before we finish, we really have to look at how they integrate. The body doesn't operate these nerves in isolation. And the ultimate example of this integration is swallowing, an action that requires split-second coordination between multiple nerves. This happens at the pharyngeal plexus.
The pharyngeal plexus is an intricate network of nerve fibers resting right on the superficial surface of the middle pharyngeal constrictor muscle. It is the ultimate neurological crossroad.
Who contributes to this plexus?
It combines 3 elements. First, sensory GVA fibers from the glossopharyngeal nerve, IX, providing the tactile feedback from the mucosal lining. Second, motor SVE fibers from the vagus nerve, X, which remember are carrying hitchhiking fibers from the accessory nerve, XI, to provide the forceful contraction of the constrictor muscles. And third, postganglionic sympathetic fibers from the superior cervical ganglion to control the local blood vessels.
A complete sensory, motor, and autonomic ecosystem. And we see the absolute necessity of this ecosystem perfectly demonstrated by the gag reflex.
The gag reflex is a visceral protective mechanism to prevent choking. It relies entirely on 2 cranial nerves functioning in a coordinated arc.
Walk us through the circuit.
When an irritant or object touches the posterior wall of the pharynx or the posterior tongue, the glossopharyngeal nerve, IX, acts as the afferent sensory limb. It detects the physical touch and fires an action potential straight back into the brainstem.
The warning signal.
Exactly. The brainstem processes this instantly and fires an efferent motor command back out via the vagus nerve X through the pharyngeal plexus.
And the vagus tells the palatal muscles to tense and the pharyngeal constrictors to violently contract, expelling the object.
Afferent in via IX, efferent out via X. If a patient suffers a stroke affecting the glossopharyngeal nerve, the sensory input is gone. The reflex is absent. If the vagus nerve is lesioned, they might feel the object, but the motor execution fails. The reflex is absent.
And clinically, if you look at the soft palate of a patient with a unilateral vagus lesion and ask them to say, ah, you see that unopposed action again? The paralyzed side of the palate sags. The healthy levator villi palatini muscle on the uninjured side contracts, pulling the uvula away from the lesion.
Structure dictating physical presentation. It's beautiful.
Which brings us perfectly to our key takeaways from Chapter 18. First, the 12 cranial nerves are the functional pathways from the brain, transforming central processing into lived physical reality. Second, each nerve carries highly specific modalities, general or special, somatic or visceral, which dictate its precise cellular function. Third, the structural routing of these nerves is heavily influenced by embryonic development and spatial efficiency, leading to phenomena like parasympathetic hitchhiking and the tortuous loop of the recurrent laryngeal nerve. Fourth, clinical testing relies entirely on understanding these pathways. A specific functional deficit, like a deviated jaw, an abducted eye, or a loss of taste, allows a clinician to accurately localize the anatomical lesion.
Without a scan.
Right. And finally, complex survival behaviors like swallowing, visual tracking, and the gag reflex rely entirely on the seamless, high-speed integration of multiple cranial nerve systems working together.
I really want to reiterate the anchor of our discussion. The meticulous mapping of these foramina, ganglia, and branches is not an exercise in rote memorization. It's the foundation of clinical reasoning. When a surgeon navigates the neck or a neurologist examines a drooping face, they are relying on this exact structural blueprint to predict outcomes and preserve function.
And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to consider. Think again about that chorda tympani nerve. A bundle of axons leaves your brainstem, navigates the dense bone of your skull, strings itself right across your eardrum, escapes out a microscopic fissure, and hitches a ride on the totally different nerve just to deliver the taste of a lemon from your tongue.
Yeah.
Every single time you enjoy a meal, every time you speak, every time you blink, you are relying on anatomical detours and structural alliances that span millions of years of evolutionary history, all firing flawlessly in the dark of your skull. What other hidden architectural marvels are operating inside you right now, just to let you experience this very second?
Gives you chills. It really does. Now, to reinforce the clinical reasoning we built today, let's run through 7 single best answer questions. Question 1. A 52-year-old patient presents to the neurology clinic with a severe acute medial deviation of their right eye. They complain of debilitating double vision, particularly when looking to the right. Upon examination, pupillary reflexes are normal, and they can elevate the eyelid without issue. Which cranial nerve is most likely damaged? A. Oculomotor. 2. B. Trochlear, C. Trigeminal, V or D. Abducens nerve. So the correct answer is actually D, the abducens nerve. The clinical sign of medial deviation indicates that the medial rectus muscle is contracting without opposition. The abducens nerve provides GSE innervation solely to the lateral rectus muscle, which abducts the eye. When the lateral rectus is paralyzed, the healthy medial rectus innervated by the intact oculomotor nerve just pulls the eye immediately. Options A and B are incorrect because an oculomotor lesion would present with a down-and-out pupil, ptosis, and a dilated pupil, while a trochlear lesion would prevent inferolateral rotation.
Fair enough. Question 2. During a complex excision of the submandibular salivary gland, a surgeon accidentally severs a nerve that loops underneath the submandibular duct. Following the surgery, the patient reports a complete loss of general touch and temperature sensation on the anterior 2/3 of their tongue on that side, though they can still move the tongue normally. Which nerve was injured? A. Chorda tympani, B. Lingual nerve, C. Glossopharyngeal nerve, or D. Hypoglossal nerve?
The correct answer is B, the lingual nerve. The lingual nerve, a major branch of the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve, V3, supplies general somatic afferent, or GSA, sensation to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. While the chorda tympani, option A, physically joins the lingual nerve in this region, severing the chorda tympani alone would cause a loss of taste, SVA, and salivation, GVE, not a loss of general touch sensation. The glossopharyngeal, option C, supplies the posterior third of the tongue, and the hypoglossal, option D, is entirely motor.
Perfect. Question 3. A 35-year-old female patient is undergoing diagnostic testing for suspected multiple sclerosis, a disease characterized by autoimmune destruction of central nervous system myelin. She presents with acute, painful vision loss in her left eye optic neuritis. Why is the optic nerve uniquely susceptible to this demyelinating disease while the oculomotor and facial nerves remain unaffected? Is it A, it carries special somatic afferent modalities exclusively; B, its myelin sheath is produced by oligodendrocytes rather than Schwann cells; C, it lacks a protective dural sheath; Or D, it synapses directly within the ciliary ganglion before entering the brain?
The correct answer is B. As we discussed, embryologically, the optic nerve is a direct outgrowth of the diencephalon, making it part of the central nervous system. Therefore, its axons are myelinated by oligodendrocytes, which are the specific cellular targets of the immune attack in multiple sclerosis. The peripheral cranial nerves, such as 3 and 7, are myelinated by Schwann cells, which are generally spared in MS.
Brilliant. Moving on. Question 4. A patient recovering from a severe viral infection develops Bell's palsy, resulting in a unilateral flaccid paralysis of the entire right side of their face. During the clinical interview, the patient complains that everyday noises, such as the clattering of silverware or their own chewing, sound excruciatingly loud in their right ear. Paralysis of which specific muscle explains this hyperacusis? A. Tensor tympani. B. Tensor veli palatini. C. Stapedius. Or D. Posterior belly of the digastric.
The correct answer is C, the stapedius. The stapedius muscle, innervated by a tiny branch of the facial nerve, the aventора within the bony facial canal, contracts to dampen the vibration of the stapes against the oval window, protecting the inner ear from loud noises. When the facial nerve is inflamed in Bell's palsy, this muscle is paralyzed, leading to hyperacusis. The tensor tympani, option A, performs a similar protective function but is innervated by the trigeminal nerve V3, which is totally unaffected in Bell's palsy.
Question 5. Secretion of saliva from the parotid gland requires parasympathetic stimulation. Which of the following cranial nerves provides the original preganglionic parasympathetic GVE fibers that eventually synapse in the otic ganglion to drive this secretion? A. Facial, 7. B. Glossopharyngeal, IX. C. Vagus, X. Or D. Trigeminal, V.
The correct answer here is B, the glossopharyngeal nerve. The glossopharyngeal nerve, IX, sends preganglionic parasympathetic fibers via the lesser petrosal nerve to synapse the otic ganglion. The postganglionic fibers then utilize the trigeminal nerve, option D, as a structural taxi, hitchhiking along its auricular temporal branch to physically reach the parotid gland. The facial nerve, option A, drives the submandibular and lacrimal glands, not the parotid.
Okay, almost there. Question 6. A patient undergoes a total thyroidectomy for a large invasive goiter. Post-operatively, the patient is unable to speak above a harsh whisper and exhibits severe dysphonia. Laryngoscopy reveals that the vocal fold on the left side is completely immobile and rests in a paramedian position. Which nerve was most likely damaged during the dissection of the posterior thyroid capsule? A. External branch of the superior laryngeal nerve. B. Internal branch of the superior laryngeal nerve. C. Recurrent laryngeal nerve. Or D. Glossopharyngeal nerve.
The correct answer is C, the recurrent laryngeal nerve. This branch of the vagus nerve ascends in the tracheoesophageal groove directly behind the thyroid gland, making it highly vulnerable during thyroid surgery. It provides motor innervation to all intrinsic muscles of the larynx except the cricothyroid. Damage results in paralysis of the vocal fold. The external branch of the superior laryngeal nerve, option A, innervates only the cricothyroid muscle. Its isolated injury causes mild pitch issues, but not complete vocal fold immobility.
And the final question. Question 7. A neurologist is performing a cranial nerve examination on a stroke patient. When the physician touches the back of the patient's pharynx with a cotton swab on the left side, there is no gag reflex. Furthermore, when the patient is asked to say, the soft palate elevates only on the right side, causing the uvula to deviate sharply to the right. Based on these specific clinical signs, which neural circuit is compromised on the left? A. Trigeminal afferent and facial efferent. B. Glossopharyngeal afferent and vagus efferent. C. Accessory afferent and hypoglossal efferent. Or D. Vagus efferent and hypoglossal efferent.
The correct answer is B. The gag reflex relies on the glossopharyngeal nerve, IX, for its sensory afferent, basically feeling the swab, and the vagus nerve, X, for its motor efferent limb contracting the pharynx and palate. The absence of the reflex indicates a failure in this circuit. Furthermore, the asymmetric elevation of the palate completely confirms a unilateral vagus motor lesion. The healthy right levator veli palatini muscle pulls the uvula towards the intact right side, away from the left-sided lesion.
And that wraps up our deep dive. Here are the details of this episode.
Cranial nerves, the 12 messengers of the mind. Byline. 12 paths leaving the brain, each carrying a different language of sensation, motion, and survival. Episode description. If Chapter 17 was the axis, this chapter is the distribution network. From the brainstem emerge 12 distinct pathways, each with. From the brainstem emerge 12 distinct pathways, each with a purpose. From the brainstem emerge 12 distinct pathways, each with a territory. From the brainstem emerge 12 distinct pathways, each with a vulnerability. Together, they transform central command into lived experience. Together, they transform central command into lived experience. Sound. Together they transform central command into lived experience. Expression. Together they transform central command into lived experience. Swallowing. Together they transform central command into lived experience. Speech. Together they transform central command into lived experience. Key takeaways. Together they transform central command into lived experience. 12 cranial nerves, functional pathways from brain. Together, they transform central command into lived experience. Each nerve carries specific modalities. Together, they transform central command into lived experience. Some are pure, are all 8288. Together, they transform central command into lived experience. Some are mixed, V79X. Together, they transform central command into lived experience. Clinical testing localizes lesions precisely. Together, they transform central command into lived experience. Integration across nerves enables complex behaviors.